quarter and this point of the academic year where I know I'm praised and everybody I talk to is praised, and there are a million things going on and a million different directions you could be pulled. So I really appreciate everybody coming out, and I think it's really a sign of how important this conversation that we're going to have today is. So this event is a co-sponsored event with the UC Humanities Research Institute, thanks to David Goldberg, who is our moderator, and the Center in Law, Society, and Culture on campus. And we planned it late because so much has been happening on this campus and other campuses around the UC system that really call for a conversation about how the university is responding to critiques of itself and how things like criminalization seem to be seeping into responses on different campuses. So we've got a really varied group of people to talk about these issues today, and we're hoping to have you join in the conversation. So each person's going to talk for about 15 or so minutes, and then we'll have time to have conversation with all of you at the end. So let me begin by introducing David Theo Goldberg, who will be our moderator and who will then introduce our panelists as well. So thank you again. And David Goldberg, Director of Humanities Research Institute.
Thanks very much. I want to thank Mona Lynch. This particular forum grew out of a conversation she and I had a month or so ago about our concerns about the direction the university was taking with respect to dissent and expressing, as we put it, what's on our minds regarding the university and the rather onerous imposition that the university seemed to be adopting with respect to that set of concerns. I mean, you all have some idea, no doubt, about what's been happening at the most visible recent expressions of this sort, whether at Berkeley or on our own campus here at Irvine or at San Diego, and we have representatives in a way from at least two of those three campuses, and actually all three. And but there's a long-standing tradition across the University of California, when you think back to the free speech movement, to UCLA, to other expressions on pretty much every full-service campus of the University of California over the last, whatever it is, 45 or 50 years, about concerns to express dissent when dissent is warranted, express criticism when criticism is warranted, and the various versions of response, as I say, that have become more intrusive of late with respect to the expression of such dissent. Now, before I introduce our wonderful panel, I just want to say a few words about this. I was wandering up the mall just outside here a couple of days ago, and just outside Starbucks, sort of on the mall, I saw what looked like a student selling T-shirts that had "fuck parking" on it. And I thought to myself, you know, this is interesting. I mean, clearly parking rates have gone up, and so the neoliberal university is causing some response, right? And I thought, well, cool. And I was running a bit late, so I ducked through, ducked into the administration building where we used to be located, and it's quite familiar to me. And it was at 2:45 in the afternoon, not 6:45, so it was still open, right? If you didn't notice, I mean, they've closed it down earlier in order to, namely at 5:30 rather than 6:30, in order to restrict the hours of dissent that could be expressed against the administration, right? And there are two doors, as anybody who's been in that building know, in and out of the building on the second floor. And at each of the doors was a single uniformed parking law enforcement person looking suspiciously at everybody going in and out of the building. So fuck parking took on a rather resident kind of meaning at that moment. And I began to understand what the concern was right, on the T-shirt, I think. I mean, maybe it was still about parking, you know. But that said, I mean, you know, the fact that it raises that kind of suspicion on the one side, and on the other, that the Chancellor, not a day and a half ago, could come out and express concern about some, you know, somebody expressing a recourse to violence or something like that, without any indication of what it is that prompted the actual expression of concern by the Chancellor. So apparently somebody, you know, at the flagpole said something that was then reported to the administration that then prompted this response. But any kind of contextualizing of what the object of concern is raises real questions about what we could believe, about what we're for, what we're against, what is justifiably to be criticized, and so on. I was reminded in coming over here this morning from the building across the way that this at UCI is Kindness Month. So we're to be kind to each other. I hope we're all kind to each other over here. But we might call on that generosity from the point of view of the administration more generically, right? With respect to dissent, to its criminalization, you know, to the sense of impatience that seems to kick in on the part of the administration at the very moment that dissent against it is expressed. One doesn't have to criminalize it. Right? There are various other forms of expression of concern, if indeed the administration is concerned, that fall far short of criminalization, that we think would be more in keeping with what a university is for. So this is part of a forum that UCHRI started in the winter about the university we are for. I mean, it's at least connected to that. There will be ongoing forums into the next academic year across the system concerning the university we are for. We're not just against something. I do want to convey that we're concerned about and concerned to engage in a vigorous conversation what kind of university we stand for at this moment in time. What is the university that is a university that criminalizes? What is a university that is more engaged in a correctional undertaking than in a learning undertaking? Right? I think those are questions that this mode of response from the administration now across the board and various administrations of the campuses, I think signal. And I think it's that set of questions, the university we really ought to be for, ought to stand for, the learning institution with which you all are concerned, because of course it's your daily life, stand for, that the speakers today will address. I want to welcome this terrific panel who at very short notice, in very busy lives, took time out of their busyness in order to be with us today and speak to us. I'll introduce them in the order in which they speak. Julia Harumi Mass is an attorney at ACLU. She works on immigration issues, immigrant rights, on labor issues, on student dissent, which is the reason she's here. She's representing a number of students that have been arrested at Berkeley. I spent a year at Berkeley in the late 1990s, and the joke was that you couldn't get your degree without having been arrested and spending a night in jail. I mean, you know, I'm not making this up. This was this sort of, but this goes well beyond anything of that kind of joking matter. And she has been at the center of representing students' rights and in the face of their criminalization. She's worked on a range of cases. She worked as a union lawyer before she became a member of ACLU, where she's worked for the last 7 years. And prior to that, she clerked for Judge Warren Ferguson of the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Second after her will be Ricardo Dominguez. Ricardo needs probably little introduction because he's been too much in the news, I think, of late, even for his own good. He is one of the co-founders of the Electronic Disturbance Theater in San Diego and off the UCSD campus, where he's an associate professor of theater. And he's also the head of a project called Thing, which has been involved in developing, I want to get this right, so bear with me, the Trans-Border Immigrant Tool, which provides those who are compelled to move across the border under difficult conditions, electronic guidance to things like water and companionship under very difficult conditions. He has been subject to investigation, is subject to investigation as we speak, as a result of a number of congressmen in the San Diego area calling attention to the supposed illegality of this work, not least with respect to the Trans-Border Immigrant Tool. I just want to raise the question, well, if one can invoke technology in order to provide guidance, and that is somehow illegal, then what about using supposedly legal technologies like firearms in order to engage in vigilante activity along the border on the part of, say, the Minutemen? Why aren't you protesting that, right? For example. So Ricardo was also engaged and perhaps what prompted much of this investigation in, as he has been for a long time, in electronic civil disobedience, and was engaged in a virtual sit-in of the President's office and website in a way that was designed not so much to I guess cause the unrunning of the administration of the University of California as much as bringing to its attention in a kind of disturbing way the actions it's been undertaking with respect to dissent and criticism. Third will be Darren Verladen, who is a PhD student here in the program in Culture and Theory. Darren comes to us from the island in the Indian Ocean of Mauritius via a master's program in race and gender studies at Trinity College in Dublin, and has now joined us and is working on issues of classification, categorization, and race, and is schooled in political theory. He will speak third. And last but not least, Cheryl Harris, who is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Professor of Civil Liberties and Civil Rights at UCLA Law School. She is perhaps best known for her work in critical race theory, and most notably for a hugely influential article on whiteness as property that we've all been moved by in anybody who does work on race and critical theory. As a national co-chair for the National Conference of Black Lawyers for many years, she got involved in international human rights law and did a bunch of work on the TRC Commission in South Africa, and also co-runs the critical race theory program at the UCLA Law School, and has long been associated with UCHRI, I have to say. So welcome back, Julia.
Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and to see such a great group of you all in the audience, and it's a special treat for me to be here with Cheryl Harris, who was one of my favorite law professors and mentors when I was at UCLA. So it's really, I feel very honored to be able to share this time with you all. As you know, California's universities are exceptionally appropriate locations for political thought, for political discussion, and for political activism. And, you know, it's because newly independent young adults come to the university kind of for many, it's the first time that they are exposed to new ideas and new perspectives and feeling their own force as political actors. And so I'm just curious, has anyone here participated in any rallies or protests in the last year? Yes. And for anyone, you know, student or non-student, was your first time participating in a rally or a protest when you entered university? Was for me. Yeah. So I want to talk about some of the student protests that went on last year around budget cuts and the university's responses. As you know, the economic crisis of the last couple of years has been particularly keenly felt by students in public universities and colleges in California. And these budget cuts and students' concerns around them really came to a head in November and December of last year. There were protests, including occupations of buildings and sit-ins at UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, San Francisco State, San Francisco City College, Cal State Fresno, and I'm sure other schools as well. The administrators' responses to the occupations and to the damage and disruption that was caused by them varied greatly. At UC Davis, students weren't disciplined at all for having participated in occupations of buildings. But at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and San Francisco State, at least, some of the ways that the administration responded came to our attention at the ACLU, and we had some grave concerns about them, so we got involved by writing letters to the universities to share our concerns. And I'll talk to you about those situations in a way to provide a backdrop for what the Constitution requires before universities can infringe on your right as students to continue with your education as a disciplinary measure. So the 14th Amendment says that government cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the Supreme Court has said that this means that the government has to give you notice and an opportunity to be heard before that you are deprived of, for example, continuing education or money. So before disciplining a student, a public university, which is the government really, has to prove that the student actually did something wrong and something that violated rules and something that's worthy of the punishment that's being imposed. For something even as short as a 2 or 3 day suspension, that means that the student has to be brought before a neutral, unbiased decision maker, be given notice of the charges against them and the evidence against them, and have an opportunity to respond. So even a 2 or 3 day suspension cannot just be issued without some kind of meeting. And for a longer suspension, or for an expulsion, or for charges that could impact your reputation, or for a restitution payment, a more formal process is necessary, one where a student can confront witnesses, can bring their own witnesses forward, and perhaps have advice of counsel. Usually the university student handbooks have these procedures laid out. The fact that they're laid out the way they are in the handbook doesn't mean that that's correct under the Constitution. Sometimes there are problems in the procedures as they're laid out, and it also doesn't mean that the university will follow them. And it's the latter problem that really came into play at UC Berkeley in the situation that we weighed in it. In December of last year, there was a big occupation of Wheeler Hall, like a week-long one, where the students were really kind of allowed to be there, and then suddenly rousted, kind of in early morning or the middle of the night by police, told that they had to leave when they thought they were going to be able to continue their occupation, their peaceful occupation. And that led then to a march and some more activity, and ended really with a big protest in front of the Chancellor's Mansion. That's what they call it there, the Chancellor's Mansion, on campus, where there were people in masks and students in masks and holding torches, and there was some vandalism, and there were maybe 100 students or more involved. At the end of the day, eight students, I believe, were arrested. And One of them was Angela Miller. She was arrested on I can't remember what kind of trespassing and vandalism type charges, disrupting the peace, etc. And she was in Santa Rita jail. She was served with a notice from UC Berkeley of an interim suspension. Now, under the student handbook for UC Berkeley, interim suspensions are only supposed to be used when a person presents a danger to campus, and they're only supposed to be limited to, in such a way, sort of narrowly tailored in such a way that you can minimize the threat of disruption or harm, but still allow the person to go to class and everything else. But instead, Angela Miller, who so far the university hasn't given her any hearing, so they don't really know her side of the story, she's told that she can't have any contact with anyone, faculty, student, staff at the university, for any reason, on any subject, on or off campus, by telephone, in person, over email, anything. She's completely cut off. Yeah, it was crazy. I couldn't believe it when I looked into it. And she wasn't given notice of a hearing, and she wasn't given notice of an end date of this interim suspension. So she's like essentially exiled from her whole community without any hearing and without any end date. She wasn't given notice of her rights to move forward with a hearing, and they didn't set one up for her until January. So, December to January, more than a month goes by. And when she goes to the hearing, they didn't give her a hearing on the merits of the charges, whether she actually vandalized, whether she actually disrupted the peace. The hearing, very oddly, was whether to extend this suspension, this interim suspension. She gave testimony that she was against violence, she was against vandalism, she was there as a peaceful protester, she was holding the torch for light. The only testimony that they provided was an officer who actually hadn't seen her at the event, but said that the officer had seen a picture of her holding a torch, and a news report issued by the university that she had been arrested in relation to this protest. So absolutely no evidence that she had done anything harmful to anyone. And the hearing panel decided that, well, they didn't really like her attitude because she didn't express remorse for her actions. And so they didn't really believe that she was against violence and vandalism. And she wasn't a particularly good student. So they extended her suspension indefinitely. This is a suspension where she didn't get to do her finals, and she doesn't get to go to class, and she can't talk to anyone. And, sort of icing on the cake, they said that she'd already violated her suspension because she'd continued living in her university housing that she had a lease for, and under state law couldn't be evicted from without, going through the state law eviction procedures. It was surprisingly over the top, really. And so we wrote a letter, and actually they did negotiate that she could go to class, so she started class 2 weeks late, and other than that, could have no contact. We wrote a letter, we criticized the fact that they hadn't given her a hearing before they put her on suspension. We criticized that the hearing that they did have ultimately actually didn't address the question that was supposed to be addressed. If what you're dealing with is an interim suspension, it should be whether she's a danger to the campus community. And that exception obviously didn't apply since they didn't have any evidence that she'd done anything to hurt anyone. And then we really made the point that the terms of the suspension were obviously a serious infringement on her First Amendment rights to speech and to association. She wasn't able to go to meetings with the Student Defense Committee or with political action groups to further their political work. She wasn't able to communicate with her faculty advisor who was representing her in the disciplinary process. And, she was supposed to be evicted from her student housing, and again, all without a hearing. So that was one incident we got involved in. The next one was UC Santa Cruz. At UC Santa Cruz, nearly 100 people, this was in November, participated in the occupation of Town Hall, which is a building on campus, for 3 days. And after the occupation, about 36 students were served with notices of charges and bills for $972 each. Even though there were 100 people who were potentially involved, only 36 were given the the bill, and that worked out to kind of an even share of what the university claimed was the total cost of like $34,000 or something. So originally they were given this notice, and the charges were laid out. There was like this huge laundry list of charges: lewd and disorderly conduct, misuse of university property, and down the line, just 20 of them or something. But there weren't any specific facts given for each student, like what did you do that was lewd and disorderly? What did you do that violated this rule or that rule or caused damage to property? So the students, this is a problem with due process. The part about notice and an opportunity to be heard. The notice means you have notice of what you're supposed to have done wrong so that you can gather the evidence and explain that you didn't do it. So again, we wrote a letter about the deficient notices, and also that they ended up being told they couldn't have a hearing. It was really odd. They were originally said they were going to have a hearing, and then they changed it, and they said, well, we're only giving you a warning. This isn't a suspension or expulsion or probation, so you don't get a hearing. Never mind that we're charging you $972. So we wrote and said, no, you do need a hearing, because this is a deprivation of property without due process otherwise. And on the point about everybody having to share in the expense without individual conduct being brought to the attention of the students, so they could be shown to be individually responsible for this amount of damage, we talked about a case called NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, which is a Supreme Court case. It involved a boycott of white businesses to protest poor treatment of black community members. And in that case, there was an ongoing boycott for several years, and there was evidence brought at trial that some of the boycott activity was illegal, that included threats and intimidation. And as a result, the trial court ordered that all of the many, many people who were involved in the boycott share in responsibility for paying the damages to the white businesses. And the Supreme Court struck it down. And what it said is that civil liability may not be imposed merely because an individual belonged to a group where some of the members committed acts of violence. For liability to be imposed by reason of association alone, you have to establish that the group itself possessed unlawful goals and that the individual held a specific intent to further those illegal aims. Here we had students in Santa Cruz who only showed up for an hour and left. And there was a liaison who served to talk between administrators and the protesters to try to work out a resolution. All of them were charged the same amount, $972, without respect to their individual participation in a group decision to cause damage. So the last example I'll talk about is San Francisco State. And this is a little bit different. It was a much smaller scale. This was 15 students who occupied a small business school building for 24 hours. And when they went in, they had consulted with an attorney, and their plan was to leave if they were asked to leave. But they were never asked to leave. They even had people outside trying to set up negotiations with the administration, and they couldn't get anywhere. So they were inside, and they were chanting, and they were, sitting in protest of budget cuts and related issues. And then, 4 in the morning, after calling on a bunch of officers from out of town to come, the administration broke into the building and took these kids and these young people and arrested 11 of them and hit 11 of them with disciplinary charges. So then, in the disciplinary charges, they offered a voluntary resolution for the 11 students, and that was going to be restitution for the damage that was caused to the building. They were told it was only going to be to fix the window that had been broken when the police broke in, and 10 of the 11 agreed. They were told it would be around $50. 10 of the 11 agreed. One of them decided to, assert his right to a hearing, so he went to hearing. Halston Chapman went to hearing, and the other 10 agreed to take the $50. Then come to find out, when they did the final accounting of the cost, they decided the restitution should really be more like $800. So the students said, wait a second, this was only supposed to be $50. We waived our right to a hearing based on misinformation, so the university eventually backed off and said, okay, well, you can have a hearing then, too. But soon thereafter, their one stalwart guy who had decided to exercise his right to a hearing had a hearing, and it actually sounds like there was a fair bit of process. He had a hearing panel, and he had the evidence against him. He was able to tell his story. But what he was told in the end was that he would be suspended for 2 semesters, and he would have to reapply to come back. To me, that sounds kind of like an expulsion more than a suspension, which is what we told San Francisco State when we said, this appears to be potentially really disproportionate to the offense. It's another part of due process is that the penalty should fit the crime. You're getting expelled for spending 24 hours in a building when nobody even told you to leave. Doesn't seem proportional. So what we did there is to figure out whether the university's acting fairly. We requested records of other forms of discipline, other times they've expelled people or suspended people under these conditions, and other times that they've dealt with discipline related to civil disobedience, so that we could have a sense of whether it's fair. And the problem with all of these examples is that not only is it not fair to the student who actually engaged in the behavior, but it's extremely discouraging to students who want to stand up and do something that's totally legal, that's completely within the bounds of what's protected by the First Amendment, peaceful protest. Because you could easily be mistakenly, hit with $972 of restitution or expelled. So I'll tell a little bit about the results of these letters. At San Francisco State, we'll have to see what we get in terms of the records, but students report they're getting more information since the letter was sent, and including that the breakdown of costs that they were charged with included costs of lodging for 3 days for some of these officers, even though this was a 24-hour occupation, and groceries, presumably to feed these officers. So, and then at Santa Cruz, my understanding is that Santa Cruz students are getting individualized hearings or being offered individualized hearings for their restitution claims. I don't know how those are going or what the response will be, how they'll come out. And the Vice Chancellor, the biggest response was from Berkeley. The Vice Chancellor at UC Berkeley issued a statement saying they're making some immediate changes and reviewing their student code in general. The immediate changes include they dismissed a bunch of charges for the original Wheeler Hall occupation because they thought there was confusion about whether they'd been ordered to disperse, which it sounds like there was. But most importantly, they're ending this no contact instruction for interim suspensions. People are not going to be isolated the way Angela Miller was. And they're going to more closely tailor, if there is really a safety concern, tailor it to addressing that safety concern. They're going to provide more information and more detailed and individualized notices to students about what conduct they're alleged to have engaged in. And what he didn't bend on was upholding the tradition of having students represent themselves in hearings. So even though due process might say you should have an attorney, you should have a right to an attorney, what the universities often say is, well, this is an educational experience. This isn't a judicial proceeding. This is an educational experience, and this is what he said in his email. This policy has withstood legal scrutiny in a number of court cases and is based on the fact that these are not judicial proceedings and that the goals for student empowerment and personal agency are best met when students, to the greatest extent possible, speak for themselves. So we hope that the Vice Chancellor understands that speaking for yourself also means being able to speak for yourself when you're occupying a building, when you're not occupying a building, but you're standing in front of it, chanting in support of the people who are inside. And that the university can't just uphold your right to speak for yourself when you're, kind of being punished. You also have to respect that students are adults and are taking responsibility for their own voices outside of that disciplinary proceeding. And so I just wanted to wrap this up by saying that, thinking about it, there's an interesting relationship between the rights and responsibilities of student protesters and the university here. Universities have a lot of discretion to punish unlawful conduct that breaks the rules, but it has to be reasonable. And it has to not disproportionately impact people who are breaking the rules in order to make a point over people who are just breaking the rules because they're, messing around. But I was surprised in talking to some students that they didn't realize this constitutional reality. The First Amendment does not protect unlawful conduct just because you're doing it to make a point. Civil disobedience is meaningful because you're willing to take a risk. The risk of going to jail, the risk of getting arrested, the risk of having consequences through the disciplinary system at school. It doesn't mean anything to occupy a building if nothing's going to happen to you. It just doesn't mean as much. You have to, the people who choose civil disobedience are making a choice to sacrifice something of their own for their cause. And that's really meaningful, but it only works if the university also makes distinctions between people who break the rules and people who don't break the rules. And that means giving them the process they need to find out whether you really broke the rules and to tell them to answer the charges through a disciplinary proceeding. And so it's really, we need to hold the universities accountable to make sure that students have their day in court, so to speak, with the universities, and then students need to realize that when they're making those choices, those are adult choices that they're making and that there may be consequences. So I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that as a result of this, working on these things, I realized that a lot of students might have training on what to do with the police when they're involved in civil disobedience, but not necessarily about what to do with their schools. And so we're putting together, I wish I had it ready, but it's almost ready, a little Know Your Rights and kind of practical tips pamphlet. Would people here be interested in something like that? Okay, I'll make sure to get it to you through folks here at UCI. Thanks.
Hola a todos, muchas gracias por invitarme. Es un placer estar aquí con todos. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the community. And one of the elements that I wanted to speak about briefly is what is the nature of performance, art, new media in relation to nomos, that is law and its construction in the university. To make it clear, everything that Electronic Disturbance Theater does, everything at BangLab, I'm also a principal investigator at Cal IT2. I run a laboratory there called BangLab, Bits, Atoms, Neurons, and Genes, is based on art practice. Art practices around performance art, specifically, which is about transgressing the boundaries of what is considered the sites of the normative line. That is, to be excessive in the process of those definitions. And this is something that I was hired for, and now they're going, gosh, some transgressions are not to be had in art, at least in the way that we feel art should play itself out. So I was trained as a classical actor. But in the 80s, I became extremely interested in critical performance or performance art. And there I started working with a young group of artists called Critical Art Ensemble. That's what we named ourselves. And at that moment, we decided that in the 90s, there would be 3 sites of performative intervention that should be developed. And that is, between 1990 and 94 would be the emergence of virtual capitalism. And there we should establish a performative matrix, which would be about civil disobedience. Electronic civil disobedience is what we termed the gesture. And this would be to disturb the conditions of data bodies in real bodies that would be processed through virtual capitalism. Electronic civil disobedience would have a similar history as that established by Henry David Thoreau in 1848 in On Civil Disobedience. which was defined in terms of the 1848 Mexican-American-U.S. War around the expansion of slave states. And so issues of blockage and trespass would be brought to the foreground in that particular performative matrix, as we called it, long before Neo came into the world. We were thinking that data bodies in real bodies would function within a performative matrix. The next level of intervention would be with the emergence of clone capitalism or genetic capitalism between 94 and 98. There we would develop community research initiatives based on our history with ACTA, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, in the 90s. We were extremely moved by the kind of counter epistemologies against the therapeutic state that was really creating a series of death drugs that weren't even dealing with the issues of HIV at that moment. And so community research initiatives against clone capitalism or genetic capitalism would be brought to the foreground. And this particularly exploded after 2001 with the arrest of Steve Kurtz, a member of Critical Art Ensemble. He was accused of bioterrorism for an artwork that was about to be presented at MoMA in Boston. It was a 4-year trial, and Homeland Security lost. As we said, art is not a crime. Then between 1998 and 2001 would be the emergence of particle capitalism or nanotechnology. And so there, the performative matrix of intervention would be around nanotoxicology. So all of this work was developed through the 90s. I took on the performative matrix of electronic civil disobedience. In 1994, with the Zapatistas, as they emerged into the electronic fabric, or as they say, ripped into the electronic fabric, it became the first postmodern revolution, something that the RAND Corporation in '91 said would never happen. That is, cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, the way they defined it, would come from the US, would come from Europe, would come from Israel. You needed to have infrastructure, that is telephony, computers, you needed to have syntactical knowledge, software knowledge, and you needed to have semantic control of those systems. You needed to be so-called first world knowledge makers in order to create these sort of encounters. But I felt that electronic civil disobedience went against the grain of those definitions: cyber war, cyber crime, cyber terrorism. And while we had the performative matrix, we really didn't have that jumping off point, that line of flight. The Zapatistas, ripping into the electronic fabric, had no telephones, had no electricity, had no semantic knowledge, supposedly, of how to create the first postmodern net social space of peace and justice. It was a cry for humanity and ya basta against neoliberalism. So it was with the Zapatistas that we started the digital Zapatista movement, whose basic vision would be to push the system of politics online from communication and documentation, which is the main performative matrix, to that of nonviolent direct action online. The unbearable weight of human beings who have been marginalized from all those other spaces, such as the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, to have ya basta online. So between 1994 and 1998, I worked doing a series of performances. The core one was at MIT, called Zapatista Port Action at MIT, Rabinal Aquí, the only Mayan play that we know of about a sky warrior fighting the Rain King. It was there that I began to talk to the digital Zapatista movement using early progressive video, progressive audio, later became real video, real audio. And we communicated around the world trying to translate our ideas about electronic civil disobedience. And there was a group called the Digital Anonymous Group out of Italy. It said, "Oh, ciao, bello, come stai?" We got an idea. And we couldn't really understand what the Italian community was saying. But we understood baci baci. But what they said was an idea of net strike. And that is that nomos in the digital age was bound to the condition of the browser. Remember, at the moment the Zapatistas emerge in '94 is the same moment that Mosaic, the first browser, comes online, right? So there is a connection in the way the browser is created. So we began to imagine that the browser was the post-contemporary agora. There was the public market space, the sharing space. There would be then a space for demos. those who demonstrate, demos, that of democracy, right? Democracy is based on demonstration. And we felt that it was demonstration of those who did not have access to infrastructure, syntactical knowledge, or semantic processing. So we would bring demos onto the Agora through the process of electronic civil disobedience. We would take over the dromocratic, that is dromos, those who are bound to the politics of speed. We would take their speed lines in order to create not a politics of technology, but as the Zapatistas say, to move at the speed of dreams. So speaking to the Italians and communities around the world, we decided that on these public agora of the browser, there was refresh, reload buttons. Remember the Matrix, reloaded. Well, we knew about reload long before that, right? And we said, what if we all went to President Cedillo's website between 1 and 3 Mexico City time and hit the reload refresh button over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And I said, fantastico, that is a great idea. We shared it very quickly. Mayan technology was moving at the speed of dreams. Then I got an email from a young new media artist in San Jose, and he said, Ricardo, I've been part of the Mayan technology Rabinaliki listserv, and I think I can create a simple JavaScript that will count how many people come. And that way we don't have to hurt our fingers. It will just count for us. I said, fantastico. He said, but I hate this new HTML stuff of the browser. It's the ugliest thing I have ever seen. I want nothing to do with browsers. I said, that's fine. There's a system administrator who's very interested at MIT about digital zapatismo, and I think her name was Carmen Karasek. She might be interested in doing an HTML electronic monument to the men and women and children Zapatistas that had died due to paramilitary action by the Mexican government. So I told them, go off to the digital corner, bring back a monument that performs. I was at The Thing, an ISP for artists and activists that started in 1991 in New York City. I was a co-director with Wolfgang Stehler, conceptual artist. And Wolfgang was Germanic, and he said, I'm very bored by all of you. But the good thing about Wolfgang's conceptual boredom was, as long as you were doing something on this internet service provider, that was fine with him. So I said, Wolfgang, we're going to do a digital Zapatista action. It's going to be electronic civil disobedience. He said, I'm already bored. So we took that to be as a thumbs up. At that moment, I started the Electronic Disturbance Theater, based on the very first book by a critical art ensemble called Electronic Disturbance. One of the elements was that there was a young scholar, Stefan Ray, who had done an interesting MA thesis on information war, drug war, and Mexico in 1993 that I had read. He had become a PhD student at NYU. He came into the Thing office in Chelsea, New York, where I was, said, Ricardo, I want to take electronic civil disobedience beyond what the critical art ensemble had theorized. I said, fantastico, we're about to do a gesture tomorrow. And you can participate, join us. And that's when we started the Electronic Disturbance Theater. But before we did it, I said, there's something I've been thinking about, that this performance needs to do something to counter cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime. Taking on the wired ideology of California ideology, that the networks were about anonymity, no class, no race, no gender. In cyberspace, no one knows you're a dog, right, was the way it was sold at that period. And I say, we're going to speak very directly. There is class, there is race, there is gender. We are going to bring our data bodies and real bodies together. We are going to be radically transparent. That means when we start an action, we're going to let everybody know who we are, where we live, what we're doing, how we're doing it. Nothing will be hidden. This was a problem for some of the electronic disturbance theater. Remember, the ideology of anonymity was a predominant performativity in that culture. But finally, we agreed. We launched the year-long performance against Mexico, the Department of Defense, the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, who was trying to buy uranium rights using neoliberal policy in Chiapas. It worked extremely well. The next day in the New York Times, we were introduced as hacktivist, front page. And we got more front page news as we went along. So this particular part of the performance that I'm here today is not new. It is, again, as many have said, this has happened before and it will happen again. So say we all. So the performative matrix, an assemblage of data bodies and real bodies as a new type of recombinant theater, electronic disturbance, critical art ensemble, published copyleft or copyright, available online, never copyright. ECD is CD reinvigorated. What CD once was, ECD is now. One of the rhetorical gestures that we said was activists of the 90s who believe that the streets are the space to embody politics are going up the wrong tree. The streets are dead capital. Universities are dead capital. Monuments are dead capital. Taking over the White House, it's not going to do anything. Virtual capitalism only wants the flow. That's where the disturbance has to be. Of course, this wasn't a very happy note for activists to hear. But again, we're performance artists and we like to transgress certain lines. The electronic disturbance theater then got a lot of good reviews. The U.S. Department of Defense launched the first information war weapon at us during our performance at Ars Electronica, Info War performance. We called it Swarm, 1998, September 9th. They launched the first known information weapon that we've ever seen. Of course, everybody said they had these things, but part of the performative matrix is to take measures of power. That is, instead of showing you, look at the bad people doing bad things, they actually walk on stage and they show you what the measures of power are. So the outcome of that performance was that they launched this information war weapon at us. Our servers are in New York City, so they broke the Posse Comitatus Law of 1878. That is, they have to use the FBI or police or civil society to take you down instead of dropping B-52 bombs on you when you're protesting. So we were contacted by some legal people and said, do you want to take this on? We didn't think it was the best kind of ending to our performance. We wanted a better review. So we did a gesture against DOD one more time. Then on the front page of the New York Times, they said, if electronic disturbance theater wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. So one of the problems of electronic civil disobedience, again, we are performance artists, is that we don't function as activists, right? Activists are dealing with very deep issues, and we certainly take on dialogues with activist communities and share this work with activist communities. But this is performance art. And so soon after this, we were invited by the NSA to come do a performance for them. I don't know if any of you have ever done a performance for the NSA. Raise your hand. Well, we knew they wanted to data mine us. Why couldn't they arrest us, right? So we did a performance for them. On one side was a DJ that we brought in, one of our good friends, using some DJ Spooky-like things. We had Stephen Ray on one side giving a very Kafkaesque reading of exactly what we had done, what had gone on, Mexican government being hostile and telling us they're going to kill us or what have you. And I was doing Mayan technology stories, right, based on Zapatista stories. And we ended our performance. They were not very happy. They said, what is Mayan technology and why can't we arrest you? And I said, because all of you haven't really understood that simulation colliding with virtuality creates actuality, right? And the performative matrix is about affect, not effect. That is, effective affects. And all of you are probably in the same position as the very first play ever written here in the United States in English, called My Country Cousin. There's a Daniel Boone-like character who was invited by his city cousins in Philadelphia to come and visit them, right? So Philadelphia was civilization as we know it. He went to the play, he jumped on stage, hit the bad guy, rescued the heroine. And they said, no, the bad guy is just pretending, the heroine is not a virgin, all that sort of stuff. And so the DOD, the NSA, UCOP are like the country cousin. They're unable to understand simulation, virtuality, colliding in actuality. That what they're responding to is a very affective performance. They're trying to stop Hamlet from doing what he always does every night around the world, just because it feels like it's actually happening, right? Again, performance. Digital Zapatismo, electronic disturbance theater, rely on simulation to create disruptive, disturbing presence in the material, social, and discursive context in which they operate. Thus, the goals of electronic disturbance theater perform disturbances to block virtual capitalism's race toward witlessness and social consequences of the immaterial, ethics that creates. New forms of online collective action enable EDT help map alternate geographies of struggle, alternate forms of embodiment against this exploitative weightlessness. So this brings us to then BangLab. I was hired because of electronic civil disobedience to come to UCSD in 2005 to create a laboratory at Cal IT2 that would focus on electronic civil disobedience theory and practice. That's what I was hired for. Then they said, but you're going to have to do something more. I said, okay. How about if I start border disturbance technologies? They said, that's good, we like border disturbance technologies. And I said, but before I come, I want access to your nanotechnology labs. And they said, okay, that's fine. So there are 3 areas of investigation at BangLab. The advancement of electronic civil disobedience and activism, theory and training. 2, the development of border disturbance technologies. 3, investigations into nanotoxicology and unregulated products that are being sold on the market now. So, talking to my longtime collaborator, Brent Stahlbaum, who's at UCSD, I was interested in located media practices using GPS. I wasn't interested in the urban practices of new media technology. And so he had been doing a lot of off-grid GPS, that is going on high-risk trails in the desert. And I thought that non-urban use of GPS would be very interesting. So in 2007, using his new algorithm, a virtual hiker that he developed, we started thinking, wouldn't this virtual hiker be useful in the issues of the humanitarian crisis on the border, people dying, disorientation, not having water. So we decided to create a new geography of morals, a new geology of ethics. This was the proposal, not a very good proposal, but it was to take geopositioning systems and create a transporter tools for immigrants, allow a virtual geography to mark new trails and potentially safer routes in the desert of the real. Ultimately, what happened was that we took Mary Pat Brady's theory that the border was a state-sponsored aesthetic project. That is, we would use art against art to develop a new enfoldment of art. This is the way the tool works. It's a simple GPS. One of the things I always ask my researchers is, you have to think horizontally in terms of the performative matrix of the investigation and art that we do here. One, there has to be a conceptual idea. We come from a conceptual department, so the conceptual. If you can break it down to 1 word or 3 words for your conceptual frame, that's what we want. So, for instance, transporter immigrant tool. The concept itself is deployable. People will respond affectively just to that. On the other end, a ubiquitous technology that's inexpensive, that is simple. Cell phones, you can buy them, iMotorolas that we're using now, under $6 on eBay. 2, the syntactical. Is the code simple? Is it easy? Can anybody with a little bit of training learn? Yes, the midlets were available. So it does satellite acquisition like all GPS. It creates a simple compass, points directly to the nearest cache of water that Water Station Inc. and Border Angels leave out in the desert. And then I'll hurry along. It finds it, normal navigation mode. If you can't read the screen, you can say agua, and then it starts vibrating like water wishing if you're getting close to the direction of agua, because sometimes the screen is very small. We also create this interface, and one of the other elements is that we've here now it found water. It's telling you. The difference now is that it has how far right in the middle. This is a bit of a test. See if it runs. If we have a chance to check it. I won't. Anyway, it's a simple test. I'll go back a little bit. The other thing is that we decided that at the end of 2007, to create poetry that's enfolded into the tool. We got money from Cal IT2 and UCSD to build the tool in 2007 and to put poetry in it. We have a poet who's been working on developing the tool. So it's to deal with this particular issue. What has occurred is to create a, sorry, I'm just moving forward a little bit, is to go from a GPS to a global poetic system. That is, we're not interested in geo-positioning systems. We're interested in the global poetic system that brings to the ground the call for trans-global citizenship, the rights of safe passage, the right of sustenance, that is not only about water, but about the sustenance of poetry and what art can do. So all of this brought me into a whole lot of trouble because people don't like art. Using electronic civil disobedience, I teach a class every winter called Electronic Civil Disobedience. At the end of this class, we go from Thoreau to Gandhi, Martin Luther King, ACT UP, and then we select a virtual sit-in. The students then decide. As you know, March 4th was the budget. There were issues around racism. So they said, let's do an action against UCOP. I said, fine, let's do that. It's a good way. I'll see how you do the code. You get your final. What will happen? Well, you know, last time we did one, before I got tenure, the UCOP didn't say anything, right? We protested their weaponization of nanotechnology. It's on my CV, and I even got a letter from the Senior Vice Chancellor saying, great work. You got tenure for all the work that you're doing. But the March 4th action seemed to get a different affective response. So this is the letter from the Senior Vice Chancellor. Dear Professor Dominguez, I like the dear. On March 4th, 2010, I received a report from Administrative Computing Telecommunication Act that you, using your computing resources, CalIT2, launched the denial of service attack. Again, that is wrong. A denial of service attack is an embedded zombie net. You don't know what's happening to you. There's no way anybody can stop it. It is anonymous, it is secret, it's a zombie system. A virtual sit-in is fully conscious. You know what's happening. You've chosen to enter into the artwork. You know who is doing it and why. All you have to do is view source, and you'll see exactly why, or just read the email we sent you. On the server at Office of the President, University of California, when ACT is informed of denial of service attack, their standard protocol is disconnect the computer from the network. They disconnected me, a real denial of service. I didn't even ask. They just pulled the plug. A lot of students' homework and finals were on there. We had to fight hard for 8 days to get it back up. I have instructed ACT not to reconnect the server pending decision of Office of the President as to whether they intend to initiate criminal or any other charges related to denial of service attack. I expect to hear from the Office of the President very near future. So they initiated investigations on January 11th this year. They started an investigation of the transporter immigrant tool. It was basically an accounting, that is, what was the proposal, what did we spend the $5,000 on, right? They have all the information. It's now gone on, it's continued on, no end date in sight. We know that 3 Republican congressmen sent an email to Chancellor Fox on March 17th. We didn't receive that letter, we only got it through a reporter a bit later. That investigation is ongoing. The investigation around the civil disobedience action is ongoing as well. The first action, investigation, the community of 200 went with me to the gathering to meet Assistant Vice Chancellor Burke. I went in, as I was going in, we decided to take a vote. Should I go in? And everybody said no. And if I go in, what should I tell them? Because I'm going to tell them no, now that you guys said I shouldn't say. They said, well, tell them they could come outside with all 200 of us as witnesses to be radically transparent and to start the investigation in question. So I walked into the office and there were cops all over. Same cops who had already come to my office at CalIT2 to begin their investigation. I went in, told Senior Vice Chancellor, we don't want to have the meeting out here. Can you guys come out here? And they said, no, this is private. I then went to the exterior door of my chair's office, kept the door open even though the police were trying to close it, and I said, they don't want to come out. What should I do? And they said, you should get legal counsel then. And I said, am I going to need legal counsel? And they didn't say, they don't want to say, do I need legal counsel? So then I took a vote. Everybody said I should shut down the element of the investigation there until I get legal counsel. I then told them, I went in and said, I'm going to hold this off till I get legal counsel. We then went outside and read all the hundreds of letters that we have received of support. And then the police came out saying that the Assistant Vice Chancellor Burke were very afraid of coming out. Could we create a wide area for them to cross? We said certainly they're welcome to join us and read the letters, or all of that. And so the investigation is continuing. I got a legal counsel of 7, which is very costly. because the lawyers have said that each of them don't have all the knowledge to deal with all the different elements. So I started a legal action fund and a trust fund, and I'm going to start a legal action fund committee, which is in development. And then I'll just leave you with this little gem from the Fox News, our favorite people.
438 points up so far early in the trade war, started about 10 years ago. A UCSD professor is towing the line between freedom of speech and a federal crime. He organized an online stunt that could put his tenure on the line, but if the feds get involved in all of this, he could stand to lose a whole lot more than that.
It is not often that an artist, a university, and a politician collide, but it's all happening here at UCSD. And controversial art professor Ricardo Dominguez is right in the middle of it. It isn't the first time he's been there either. His so-called trans-border tool caught a lot of attention a few months back. The yet-to-be-created phone application would help guide illegal border crossers to water and right through Border Patrol stations. Now, it is a virtual sit-in that Dominguez helped organize that's getting him a lot of attention. It's a kind of online protest, much like what he helped create back in the 1980s.
We established the theory of electronic civil disobedience, another unpopular idea.
On March 4th, Dominguez claims to have led about 400 people in a virtual sit-in against the president of the University of California's website, essentially shutting it down. He calls it hacktivism, but others call it a denial of service attack.
A digital sit-in is kind of I guess what you would call hacktivism, and
This is the
I
FBI.
don't think hacktivism is treated any differently than hacking with malicious intent.
What he did was make available a program that all the
Well,
protesters
I'll just end it.
downloaded
I'll just
and
end
then
it there.
all engaged at the same time.
So the victory of that was that I got the LA Times front page and Fox News, that usually hates everything in terms of the artwork that I do and that my community of artists do, is that they said this was not an effective performance, but an affective performance that was extremely effective. All right, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank David and Mona for extending the invitation, and I don't promise to be able to follow in the footsteps of Ricardo, so probably going to be more welcome. But I want to do something that might sound a bit paradoxical for a channel that's called speaking my mind and the critical university, because I want to argue against the idea that everyone is entitled to an opinion. And I want to argue against this, and hopefully you'll see why, because I want to make some arguments about democratic practice. And so I want to consider three things. First, that the idea that everyone is entitled to an opinion is a kind of mystification that hides a political dimension that is too often ignored, not only in our relation to the administration or to the law, but also in the very way we organize and conduct ourselves. And second, this political dimension itself brings up the question of democracy. And since it's America's latest mega export, so maybe we need to talk about it. So maybe we're exporting too much and there's not much left at home in the end. So, but I think the question of democracy is important here, because I think sometimes when we organize and protest, and we tend to focus too much on the question of funding and the distribution and redistribution of money, and fail to address the political dimensions which can allow us to imagine alternatives, right? And thirdly, I will then link the two of these two ideas to what can be called the ethos of the critical university as opposed to the ethos of a socializing university, which we tend to have now. And so it's probably good to start with campus policies on free speech and student conduct. So what's called the University of California policies applying to campus activities, organizations, and students. It's a mouthful. I start here because many students have been served with the student conduct letters for participating in various protests, not only on the UC campuses, but also off UC campuses. And so Article 3010 states that the university is committed to assuring that all persons may exercise the constitutionally protected rights of free expression, speech, assembly, and worship. And a little down in the same document, so it's Article 3038, it declares that orderly behavior and the normal conduct of university affairs shall govern time, place, and manner of exercising free speech and advocacy. So here what we see is not a prescription on what can be said, which is what the usual debates concerning free speech very often revolve around, but rather how this speech is to be delivered. Right? So this how of the speech is precisely refers precisely to the political dimension that I mentioned at the outset. Because what after all does the normal conduct of university affairs mean? And who decided on that? And what constitutes orderly behavior? Right? Does closing a door too loud constitute disorderly behavior? I mean, in the current climate, that's probably possible, right? Well, and this conjures up the question of violence as well, and non-violence, to which I will return a bit later. But, so I think just from this Article 3038, the university actually touched on the real political question here, which is not about what can be said or not, though that is important as well, but rather how is free speech exercised. That is, how is an opinion to be formed? Right? So I think that's the real question here, is how is opinion produced? For the idea that everyone is entitled to an opinion must, in a sociological sense, real inequalities in the sense that not everyone is equally equipped to form an opinion. Right? So, and one sees that every day in the classroom for everyone, that TAs or anything, that the students who are kind of a bit shyer than others rarely speak in class, while the more assertive ones tend to dominate or monopolize discussions. But on the political side, the assumption that everyone is entitled to an opinion also creates a set of practices that in fact reinforce the current state of affairs. That reinforce the socializing university. So on the one hand, this belief in itself creates an imperative to have an opinion. Right? So much so that what we get are not thoughtful arguments, but rather what we can term opinionated statements without any basis in facts or reality. And again, this is something that we see in class on a daily basis, where students feel they ought to have an opinion, and thus they advance an opinion. However badly articulated that opinion is, right? It usually boils down to something like, I don't like the article that you assigned to read. I can say this because I am entitled to an opinion. Right? It is a wonderful tautology. So, on the other hand, and this is related, because by virtue of the fact that one believes that one is entitled to an opinion, we see a form of thoughtlessness that kind of emerges. Because after all, opinions must be articulated on the spot, and since we live in societies that are infatuated with the new and with change, opinions are thought to be held and to be tossed out the next minute, as if the act of thinking before saying something has become redundant. So what is lost is the fact that thinking and forming an opinion is tied to an idea of responsibility and an openness towards others. Right? So hence the question that we must ask ourselves, and again that's the political question, I believe, because it produces conditional political norms as it is articulated, debated, and practiced, is the question of how are we to form an opinion, which brings us to the vexed issue of democratic practice. So what I'm getting at here is the fact that we often embrace political expediency and put everything to a vote, thus killing the democratic process at the same time. Right? So instead, I think the democratic process should rest on persuasion, on finding a consensus, on consensus building rather than voting, as we tend to believe in liberal democracies. And so it's on finding a consensus among those who are producing the opinion as a group, and thus recognize the inequalities among us at the same time. Right? So in that sense, equality cannot be simply presupposed in this case, and if we want a critical university. Because a critical university is one that is also deeply self-critical and reflexive, and one that questions its own practices at every turn. Right? And equality can only be achieved through this kind of reflexive democratic practice. But there's also a second issue here, because by virtue of not incorporating a democratic practice in the production of opinions, it gives the authorities an opportunity to separate opinionated statements from what can be called political speech. So again, we saw that in the case of the Irvine 11, as most of you know about this, where it was not a question of the content of what they said, but rather how it was delivered. Right? So the authorities in the end are very happy for anyone to hold opinions. Right? But political speech, because it assumes that it is communally produced, is considered dangerous and pernicious, because it reveals exactly the question of how, which unmasks the political dimension at the same time. Right? And here what is often called the force of public opinion is not merely a metaphor, because if this opinion is created communally and democratically, it carries real force behind it. Right? So this approach to democracy that I'm elaborating here is more of a communal one rather than a liberal conception that we are more familiar with. So this question of how is opinion to be produced must, at every level of the resistance against the neoliberal restructuring of the university, be posed. So each time we are taking a decision, we have to kind of produce an opinion on the production of opinion. Right? So it's not a question of simply changing our behaviors and attitudes in our everyday life, but these practices must happen at an organizational and institutional level. That is, the organization that we build to resist the cuts must themselves embody the changes that we want to see, and ipso facto embody the future university that we want as well. So that's a very old IWW idea. Within the shell of the old, we're building the new society within the shell of the old one. So hence the production of opinion must reflect what anarchists have often referred to as an ethics of practice. So it is only by building organizations model on the future university that we can institutionalize these practices so that they become the norms under which we can operate. But there's another danger that lurks if we don't take into account how in the production of opinion, because there are so many unthoughts that creep into our practices and discourses. And one of the examples that has been quite, I think it's been quite clear recently, is the idea of nonviolence. So there has been this constant reiteration of this idea of nonviolence since the protest started. And this has not come only from the administration, but also from supporters who often urge students to take nonviolent actions and engage in peaceful protests. It's all very well. However, my question is, why must this be stressed out at every turn, as if a method of protest that relies on some kind of paradigm of non-violence or some Gandhian prototype is the only type of protest that is legitimate or that is considered legitimate, right? So I'm not saying that I'm not advocating for violent protest, but I'm saying that by articulating or reiterating all the times that we need to only have non-violent protests, that we are foreclosing certain types of thoughts, right? And so what I'm saying is that the question of violence or non-violence should not be precluded, and it must be very much part of the reflective process on how action ought to be taken. In effect, we can say that the limit on thought does not necessarily come from the administration or the market, but it also comes from ourselves. Anyway, I find this idea of non-violence, that all protests must be non-violence, kind of ridiculous, right? You can carry weapons, but you cannot have a thought of doing violence, which is kind of contradiction. Radically alter the current paradigm will remain sterile if we avoid the debate on democracy. So the task of the public university is not merely to educate the public, but is engage very much in the creation of publicness, as Benjamin Baudo, I think, once called it. That is, the university's role is to serve as an institution where we learn what it means to constitute ourselves as democratic subjects in the first place. So, to create democratic subjects, the institution must itself be infused with a democratic ethos. And by ethos, I mean a set of practices, beliefs, and even myths, which all take a long time to build, obviously, right? And I think at the beginning, David mentioned about how to graduate from Berkeley, you must at least have been arrested once, right? And all these are part of an ethos of particular institutions, right? So, like here, the big shock was that people are protesting on an apolitical campus. The idea of apolitical campus is part of the myth and part of the ethos of this campus, right? So an ethos usually will then guide practices and guide what can be thought or not. And this democratic ethos must be started from the way down, from bottom down to up, right? It won't come as gifts from the top down, right? So as such, it's not only a question of budget transparency, but a deeper practice of democratic engagement. And this is very much linked to this idea of how to create opinions. Right? For the ethics of practice involved in the creation of opinion must be generalized to the whole university in all its operations. And it has to start from below, unless we are going to believe in leadership, which then makes any democratic project kind of redundant. So under the current model, the university is seen as having to serve the needs of society, that is to socialize students into the reality of society. which is increasingly being based on some kind of market fundamentalism. And this is the antithesis of the critical university, which should rest on the role of ideals in measuring, challenging, and changing the real world. And the basic difference then between a socializing university and a critical one thus revolves around the question of democracy. For this, democracy itself must always be questioned, challenged, and constantly be remolded. And a critical university is one that is first and foremost self-critical, and it must take up the democratic challenge. So we cannot avoid the debate around democracy both in and outside the university, if such a distinction can be made. And perhaps we should not forget that democracies and education have always been linked and cannot be separated. So a free university or critical university is always tethered to democracy, and this is probably a fact, not theory. So since every institution embodies an ethos, then we must ask ourselves what this ethos ought to be in a critical university. And here I only took the production of opinion as one example. Perhaps you can think of other examples. Because ultimately the ethos of the critical university will be democratic, or the critical university will not be at all. So I think that is the lesson that we can learn from the 60s, both in terms of accomplishments and the failures.
Thank you all for the invitation. It's really an honor to share a panel with such thoughtful people who have really provoked in me a desire to rethink and to keep pushing on the notion of reimagining a different possibility. I have here essentially a slide presentation that was part of a student-organized event at UCLA, which was an effort to look at an interesting, or look at the question of student speech at the UCs through an interesting juxtaposition, which is thinking about the way in which the UC responded to student speech in the context of the UCI 11 case, as opposed to what happened in reference to the speech of the students at UCSB and the Compton Cookout. And as you can see down below, the objective, as the students articulated it, was towards building an anti-racist coalition. The idea of putting these two events in conversation with each other was to think about the ways in which all communities had a stake in unpacking this, all communities had a stake in thinking about the issues that were implicated. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you the clip because this is the clip that you all know here well. This is a clip of the UCI students' protest at Ambassador Oren's speech. What we have here is, let me see here, a slide that you can't see the top of. This is an excerpt from Dean Chemerinsky's LA Times editorial. And in it, he basically argued the classic sort of First Amendment doctrinal framework for the treatment of this incident. And what, as a noted constitutional scholar, this framework is actually doctrinally correct. What Professor Chemerinsky is saying is that, in his view, the appropriate framework for evaluating this speech was that, one, no speech should ever be stopped or punished because of the viewpoint expressed. That's basically the content neutrality principle. But that nevertheless, the speech of the UCI 11 was in fact not entitled to First Amendment protection because in his view they amounted to a disruption of the speaker, a threat to silence the speaker, and thus the protest fell outside of First Amendment protections. In other words, you can restrict the speech based on time, place, and manner, right? So just as somebody conducting a class could in fact object to a student or somebody entering the class who disrupted that person and prevented the speaker from conveying the information. That was the analogy that Dean Chemerinsky drew here. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into it in detail, but what was of interest here is that the upshot of the analysis was to say there's no First Amendment right to prevent somebody from being heard, and perhaps some good can come from the incident because the university can use it to teach the students about the meaning of free speech and civil discourse. And I was thinking about Julia's presentation in the beginning about how disciplinary moments become opportunities for teaching. For any of us who've had children, we know about that influence, right? I mean, you know, there is a moment in which you say, yes, I really want to teach you something, and what you really mean is, well, you know what you know. In any event, there were others that contested Dean Chemerinsky's framing of the issue, in part, not on the doctrinal framework, but on the factual one, which was asking the question as to whether or not the level of disturbance caused by the students actually did amount to a shutdown of the speaker. That is, whether or not the successive interruptions of the speech at the beginning actually amounted to a heckler's veto. And the backdrop, the larger context that some others raised regarding the question of how students in the Muslim community have been concerned about how their speech, how their rights of protest have been treated, or what I guess I would call my thematic for today is sort of the asymmetry of power. So the problem of feeling stigmatized, feeling rejected, feeling like one's message can never be heard has to form a backdrop, some argued, for understanding what the students did. On the other hand, here we have the Compton cookout situation at UCSB. And this is the invitation as it appeared on Facebook. I won't read it all. Some of you have probably seen it. How many of you have seen it? Yeah, so it had, you know, sort of gender-specific performances required. So this invitation to act and dress based upon explicit racist and sexist stereotypes set off the chain of very troubling events, which undoubtedly many of you know. Certainly part of you were intimately acquainted with it. But one of the organizers of the event went on student radio station and subsequently called the student protesters of the party ungrateful ends. The university, however, declined to pursue disciplinary action because they claimed they lacked jurisdiction over an off-campus party and or a student-run radio station. This is the statement that I wanted to focus on for the bulk of my remarks, which I'm going to try to keep brief because I really love to have some conversation. This is the statement of UC President Yudof, issued February 26th. As leaders, we are deeply disturbed by recent events. We condemn all acts of racism, intolerance, and incivility. The acts we have witnessed are unacceptable. We denounce them. So what might a reasonable reader understand this statement to mean? What are the acts of racism, intolerance, and incivility that are being condemned? What are the acts that we have witnessed that are unacceptable? Is it the acts of the students who put up this sign on Facebook and used racial epithets? Is it the acts of the UCI 11? Is it the acts of the students in protest of what happened at UCSB? What actions is it that we have witnessed that we are to denounce? What acts are we to understand are unacceptable? In contrast, what we are told we need to do is to create an atmosphere that is open, civil, fair, caring, and respectful. That we're supposed to respect, and this is Diane's comment, differing opinions and views and experiences and background. Because we are stewards of free speech, we have to push back and to speak out against activities that promote intolerance or undermine civil dialogue. The remedy for bad speech is good speech. Okay, so what's my point here? My point here is that there's a couple of things going on. One is acts of incivility and racism are equivalent. Okay, so being rude is the same as being racist and is the same as being intolerant. So we have that conflation. The other thing we have here is the notion that the responsibility of addressing this lies with us, and that the remedy has to be that we engage in something called good speech, as distinct from bad speech. And in this context, I guess I want to argue that what that effectively means is that civility has to become a modifier of protest. Protest then is permissible within the bounds of civility. Somewhere along the line here, somebody is supposed to say, but that's an oxymoron. At what level does it become meaningful protest if it can only be civil? The act of protest is inherently disruptive, and as Julia has reminded us, sometimes costly, as Ricardo has reminded us clearly about pushing the boundaries. In what moment does it become only permissible to engage in protest if it is civil? But the underlying contradiction inherent in the claim of neutral principles and neutral sort of doctrinal frameworks in the treatment of these of speech is really revealed in this contradiction between the way in which the racist speech at UCSB was deemed to be permitted because of its time, place, and manner, and the protest speech at UCI was deemed to be impermissible because of its time, place, and manner. In each case, time, place, and manner are being applied in ostensibly neutral ways with a result that is decidedly asymmetrical. We could also think about, in contrast to the way in which these sort of constraints are being imposed upon certain kinds of speech, this false neutrality, also against the broader dynamic of how other institutional speech is protected. And we could think about and perhaps ruminate on the meaning of the recent Supreme Court opinion arguing that corporate speech in the political arena is entitled to full protection and cannot be constrained. I want to also draw on another contrast, which has to do with the claims of the inability to constrain forms of racially subordinating speech as extending into debates regarding academic freedom, which is another principle that is supposed to govern the conduct of speech at the university, and the basic idea is supposed to be that for professors and for those of us engaged in the academic enterprise, that even when we say and engage in controversial ideas, academic freedom is to protect them. No doubt those that are defending Ricardo are reading a lot of cases involving academic freedom, as well they should. The idea is that the debates, that knowledge production requires relatively unfettered debates, and that we cannot have sort of canonical truths that are protected from challenge by presumptively heretical ideas. The problem is, however, is just much like the time, place, and manner content-neutral distinctions that are applied in the doctrinal context for First Amendment law, it turns out that academic freedom is also is decidedly non-neutral in terms of its application. That is to say, certain kinds of controversial ideas are deemed to be clearly entitled to academic freedom protections, and other kinds of academic ideas are deemed to be outside the boundaries of protection. So to give one concrete example, I was just speaking about it with Julia. A controversy has emerged at UCLA Law School over the past several years over the work of a particular law professor at the school who has challenged affirmative action as harmful to black students because he says it puts them in academic environments where they cannot compete. This is an old theory, it's called mismatch theory, but his contribution some 6 years ago in a Stanford Law Review article was to make the claim that he had empirical evidence that it was so. and that therefore when black students were put into highly competitive academic environments, they were more likely to have poor grades, more likely to fail the bar, and indeed, this was an argument that basically says affirmative action is doing more harm than good. So it's not a legal argument, it's not a constitutional argument, it's an argument in which he claims to have empirical proof. Now, while he doesn't claim that the intellectual deficits are the product of genetic inferiority, he does in fact claim that they're sort of intrinsic. That is, that there's kind of nothing that the institution can necessarily do because these are the deficiencies that the students bring. They bring in deficient GPAs, they bring in deficient LSAT scores, and essentially the institution just becomes a pass-through for whatever kind of inequalities exist at the front end. Black students, not surprisingly, were quite upset, not just black students, but students of color, when when they were assigned to Professor Sanders' section in property law. And in law school, for first-year students, you don't get to choose. You are assigned to a particular professor. It's mandatory. Essentially, they infantilize you. They take you all the way back to the beginning, where they give you a set of courses and a set of instructors for the first year, and that's it. There were students who were very concerned about being assigned to his class, particularly because they had received information that the semester that the article came out, he had actually circulated it on the last day of class to all of his students in property, which of course one might wonder what was the connection. But in any event, in an effort to push back against what they felt was being essentially exposed to a hostile educational environment, they in fact organized a petition to ask him, or ask the administration to remove him from that section. Not surprisingly, the response was to say, no, we cannot remove him. Academic freedom simply would reject that notion. We can't simply say, because a professor is engaged in controversial speech, that gives the students the right to remove the person from the classroom, right? However, we're now left with this very interesting dilemma, because the consequence of the invocation of academic freedom is to essentially cut off at least one avenue of protest with regard to what the students perceive as racially subordinating speech. The members of the faculty were divided on the subject, but many of them rose to his defense because many could perceive themselves in a similar circumstance as being challenged by students for teaching controversial ideas, right? And having the administration, not wanting the administration to accede to their removal from a class. I'm not suggesting that this example has an easy answer. My point is simply to suggest why the application of neutral principles does not resolve it, why the encounters of academic freedom, First Amendment doctrine, content, place, and manner restrictions with race and other structural forms of inequality actually ends up reinforcing certain asymmetries rather than removing them. And to also point out that it's very timely that we are having this discussion this week. This week was the 40th anniversary of the killings at Kent State and at Jackson State University, which, in another lifetime, really represented a moment of in which students did in fact take seriously the notion that they were risking something to protest what they viewed to be an absolutely immoral war, and in the context of the response of the government and the university to that, lost their lives. That seems a lifetime ago, and I'm certainly not arguing for any of you to go out and lose your life. My point is simply to say that these are issues that they really do matter. They matter quite a great deal. And your ability to find your voice and navigate your way through this is critical not only for yourself and your own education, but for the larger question of the society that we all want to see. And with that, I think I want to stop here.
I want to thank you all for an incredibly engaging set of presentations. It gives one great confidence in the future of the university that you are here at the institution. We're nearly out of time. We start a little late, so I'm going to extend it a bit in the interest of getting a little discussion going and allowing or enabling you to pose some questions. If you can do it in the shortest way possible, that would be helpful to getting enabling a number of people to speak. So the floor is immediately open. Yes.
I have a sort of technical question for Julia. At what point would a disciplinary hearing jump to a real court, let's say?
Well, the disciplinary hearings that happen in the university don't jump to a real court. There are different levels of, like what kind of protections you need, what kind of rights you should have. The cases are actually pretty old and kind of all over the place, but if there, for example, was criminal conduct, you should have a right to an attorney and like the right not to incriminate yourself. Those kinds of things would come into play. It wouldn't go to a real court unless something happened and you wanted to challenge it in a real court. And then you might appeal first to your chancellor or to the president of the university and then ultimately bring a writ of mandate or something in a regular court, in a superior court.
And could you have parallel cases?
Do you mean like criminal cases?
Yeah, or civil cases.
Disciplinary.
and
Yes,
disciplinary.
yeah, you can have criminal cases going on and disciplinary cases going on. And it's tricky, so you definitely, if that's happening, want to prioritize the criminal case.
Yes.
I wanted to ask just a little more, another beat on expanding what the process of creating a critical ethos in a university might look like. You sort of invoke the Wobblies and the kind of a single jack idea of a community coming in and exerting some kind of a pressure to shape the ethos, or another word would be the character of the university. But how do you imagine that working? I mean, how do you imagine an institution like an academic institution evolving in that way? Just open-ended.
It's probably difficult to imagine the whole thing. Right? Well, we can start imagining at the level of organizations that we create that are resisting the cuts and everything. So at this level, we can start imagining how we can use consensus building instead of voting every time. Right? And then we can start imagining at a bigger level than this. And of course, as you continue building up, you're going to have to tailor the way you construct that. But we have to start imagining from the way down and start incorporating. And I think to go at the higher level, it will have to be something that's decided among all the people who are forming these communities together. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't think there's I was just curious.
Well, at UCSD, I mean, what has happened, even as we were building up a year before to March 4th, you started having different coalitions come together, like I'm on the UCSD Faculty Coalition, but then we would have members from the Grad Student Coalition, we would also have members from the Undergrad Coalition, and then each of those had different members that would switch back and forth in sharing information. And out of that came ARC, the Anti-Racist Coalition. And so then what happens is that all of them actually share multiple memberships, and they all share similar concerns. And as far as I have seen in my time there, it is very much a consensus element. That is, an idea shared, there's no general voting on it. Then the undergraduates go to their coalition, then everybody brings back. And then there were moments, say, with the Black Student Union and the racist activity where people just gathered very quickly, basically what I call sustainable pulsing and swarming. where people were just deciding different things and joining together. And so on the day of response, students occupied, and then there were, say, we in the UCSD faculty were outside saying, well, if the police come, we'll stand in front of the doors, so they'll have to go through us to get to the students. Then other graduate students, well, we'll get in front of you. And so all these ideas came together. Whether they needed to be done or not, there was just a general sense. So it was both a lived consensus and, again, I use the performance terms of swarming on these elements, and it's embodied cognition of how these things play themselves out. Although now we've come to the point where it's going, well, do we need to, who's going to sign a letter, right? The ARC is going to send the letter to somebody, who's going to sign it? And so everybody's going, well, can we all sign it? And you're going, well, okay, so, because again, the signature then can't just be ARC. It only has meaning if there's a kind of larger name behind it. So, we do come to points.
I just wanted to also point out that one of the very wonderful things about the event that we explored this conversation at UCLA Law School was that it gave us an opportunity to reach out to folks at UCSB, to people at UCI, which gave me an opportunity to meet these wonderful students right here. One of the things that I thought was an interesting sort of moment in the conversation was the felt need to start to connecting these sort of experiences across campus. And just to think about what it would mean to sort of replicate what's happening at each individual campus and create a structure that allows for memory to extend beyond the end of the school year, and that allows for there to be a flow of information that actually would, in effect, create another fluid, but very sort of adaptive kind of structure to respond to some of these things. So one of the things that I think, in terms of responding to your question, it's not that there is, I think in mind, an end point, but rather an interest in the production of a kind of process. A process that has to, of necessity, adapt to the particular conditions of the moment. One of the things that I will say, and I'm a transplant to California, I'm from Chicago, where they do politics when we live there. One of the things that I was quite interested in noting is that this particular period, the resistance to the retrenchment at the university level, was the first time that I saw a connection to the cuts in K-12. And when I first came, I couldn't understand why these conversations were happening in different universes, so to speak, but since it was very clear that it was all part of the same thing, that as a university retrenches, as K-12 sort of falls off the map, what happens is that we don't have students in our classroom. Or the students we do have in our classrooms are completely stressed because they don't have money, and they don't have, their parents don't have money. So the whole thing is connected, and I thought that this particular intervention, this moment, represented a significant step forward in connecting those struggles, which are very clearly all part of the same piece.
Because those March 4th actions at UCSD, then we all went to the marches with K through 12 and education. So that same community was very much in a circuit, and I think that was really important. And it was embodied, that is, people were out there. And the other thing that has come out of this is, because the way the university works is you're very focused on, you have to get tenure, so you have to do your work or your book or whatever it is. And so it also allows me personally to communicate with other departments that I've been partially involved with, but to have a deeper conversation where they begin to know what I do, and I get to know what they do on an intimate level, rather than just kind of partial meetings and acknowledgement. And also one of the things that came out of it was we rapidly did a book, Another University is Possible, that was developed by the students. A new newspaper came out. So there's been a lot of different expressions of how to maintain the dialogue that I think is important.
Yeah, I was just kind of pick up on that because it strikes me as if we have these two different, very different systems. If you're in the university and the administration, there's a very clear hierarchy and there's one university with these various branches, but when you're a faculty member or student on campus, you're very much just responsive to your own university, and that you really have very little connection the other way except to get these missives down from the office of the president. And it strikes me as almost deliberate because to unite, I mean, to unite means to have more power, and so to the extent that we can maybe sort of standardize or at least have some transparency about the way discipline happens across the system and the way that, you know, universities are responding to, even informally, to protest in ways that students are thinking about fighting against it. I mean, it's really sad that one of the responses from the budget crisis was for faculty members at some campuses like UCSD to say, well, let's make some universities the good ones that get this treatment and can do these things, and the others be these sort of pseudo, you know, teaching universities, where it should not be. I mean, that conversation shouldn't happen, but because of that structural problem, I think that we can get there very quickly, and these moments where people, you know, they think about the stress of their own lives and when they have to pay the bills and so on. So I wonder if the next step with all of this conversation is to continue to have maybe these campus, even roving campus conversations that bring together the struggles in the different places, not just what's happening on one particular campus.
And I think part of the way they, at least at UCSD, is to create a chilling effect, right? Because the actions, the virtual sit-in performance was the same time as the march that we had, and the marches across, so it wasn't as if we chose some random day or some random issue. It was very focused. And in a certain sense, by, say, just targeting me specifically, it's to let everybody else know there are certain spaces that you might not go, and that we will take you out of the group and focus on this person. You know, I don't think it's working that way within this particular structure, but I do feel, for instance, from young scholars who were coming to Bang Lab because they were writing about the different projects, suddenly getting responses during their job talks or from their chairs at other universities, not within UC, saying perhaps it's best if you didn't do anything on this particular work or project. Perhaps it's best that you don't talk about it during a job talk, because it might indicate that your interest and might not fit and target you very quickly in removal. And so you see a chilling effect in general to these sort of pressures of what is available to do research on or to produce work with.
I would also be interested in if any of you has ideas about how to create potential alliances with some parts of the administration of the universities, because what is distressing is there is this real assault on the universities and on education from outside, from all kinds of constituencies, and in a way it should be possible that some of the administrators, many of whom are actually faculty or former faculty, should be distressed about what is happening these days. I mean, we witnessed the dismantling of the greatest public university in this country right before our eyes, and what we see is kind of the administration sitting on these legal issues and trying to contain protests instead of forming solidarities with the concerns about education and about maintaining education. That's also something I'm coming to from learning from the 60s in a way. The most important inroads we made in the 60s movements was the alliances we were able to make with some of the people inside the university. I came from a university where the chancellor resigned because of government pressures on education and because they tried to illegalize student participation. Today, I don't see it anywhere, and this is for me one of the really distressing parts.
Yeah, there definitely are people in the administration who are distressed about the current direction that things have taken. I think unfortunately what has been, and this is just my sense, but what has constrained many of them from taking a more expansive viewpoint with reference to the relationship to student protest has been that with the Great Recession and the sort of massive retrenchment, it's almost like everybody had, or I won't say everybody, but people are pushed towards sort of protecting their own individual positions. The sense of people's vulnerability here is very, very high. And in that moment, what they might say privately, right, they are not willing to say beyond that, out of concern about protecting their own position. And so this economic context, which has heightened, all of the neoliberal problems that we've been talking about, has really placed a huge disincentive on sympathetic administrators from taking additional action. I think the answer, though, can't lie in sort of relying upon what Ricardo might call people's affective responses. I think we do have to figure out how to build a kind of irresistible set of forces outside of that compel people to come forward. Because if we think about the 60s, it's not just that people sort of changed their minds, right? The situation changed. And when the situation changed, people's reaction to it changed. And I don't know that that's a concrete answer. I guess I would say, I have plenty of conversations with people up the chain, some of which I find interesting, indeed, that they will say things, but they won't say publicly. But I do think that the answer does have to point out the realignment that you just mentioned, which is student resistance to these cuts is not detrimental to the university. It's actually essential to its salvation. And so, yeah.
And I think there is a connection between the precarious and the way administration takes that precarious moment. And I think Naomi Klein's notion of the shock doctrine and neoliberalism is also at play, and who participates in that narrative versus the precarious one. I know that at UCSD, across the board, most of the community that's administrative that I deal with, which is chairs mostly, are very supportive. But when one starts speaking to deans or up, they usually say, we can't, we can't say or do anything about the issue. So it might be very much that you have to create outside pressures that forces them into a different narrative where they perhaps can speak. For instance, with ARC, the Anti-Racist Coalition, one of the things that Senior Vice Chancellor Drake did is he sent an email to Ivan Evans, a sociologist who's part of the coalition, and says, can I speak to you about what's happening? And Ricardo, and he said, yes, but that letter was sent by the coalition, so why don't you come to the coalition and speak to us about whatever it was you're going to speak to me in private, and then he just said no. So obviously, you know, this community of privacy within the administration is very strong, and what that senior vice chancellor might have said to Ivan alone, off the record, we would be interested in hearing, but that's not going to
But it's also, and we need to end here, but I'll just sort of finish off by saying this. It's also the individualization of protest and response, both at the level, you know, he would talk to an individual, but he wouldn't talk to a group, right? He disempower an individual by empowering an individual to talk to him, so to speak, and in doing so disempower the group, right, that the person would be connected to. At a more institutional level, I think what is happening across the University of California is the individualization of the campuses, right? As you know, the only reason UCOP exists is to create policies and to pass through money. All the robust, system-wide interactive engagements of the past have been systematically dismantled. I'll give you one example from my own experience. UCHRI is a system-wide University of California Humanities Research Institute. In its first 23 years of existence, it reported directly to the Office of Research at the Office of the President. No more so, right? Along with every other multi-campus research unit, we now report directly to the campus on which we exist, right? And that systemic sort of element of the University of California is being dismantled precisely because in many there is power, right? And UCOP rules exactly by individualizing the campuses, just as administrators rule by individualizing protests. I have to thank this fantastic panel. This will be continued. Please join me.